Luke chapter number 15, beginning in verse number 11. Jesus, the master storyteller, tells one of the most famous stories, or what has become one of the most famous stories in all of the parables. We have tagged it the prodigal, or the parable of the prodigal son. The story deserves much more than just a casual glance or superficial reading. Like the parables of the lost sheep or the lost coin, the parable depicts God's joy over the salvation of the lost. In this case, one of the unique characteristics of this story is that God is not the seeker, but rather the emphasis here is on the human aspect of salvation. Our sin, rejection, repentance, and turning to God is the dramatic, moving element of the story. And of course, God's love and eagerness to forgive. The story revolves around three characters: the younger son, the father, and an older son. The younger son has been depicted as the rebellious one, the rich young brat. And he's been tagged by many as the prodigal. While the older son represents the legalist who would prefer God's judgment over grace. And of course, there's the father representing God, who is anxiously awaiting the return of his son. Let's look. Luke chapter 15, starting verse number 11. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and now is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, I just don't want to interject. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and he asked him, 'What's going on?' 'Your brother has come,' they replied, 'and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all of these years I've been slaving for you and have never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But you, when this son of yours has squandered your property with prostitutes cometh home, you kill the fatted calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything that I have is yours. But we have to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. The story of the prodigal son is a story of the Father's love. It's a story about how that God loves us and his mercy is shed upon us, and he offers forgiveness to every single person that will come to him in faith believing. I thought maybe this morning very quickly that I'd go through the story with you. It's a very common story. Most people know this story without having a whole lot of detail. But as the Pharisees listened to Jesus, they would have been in shock as they heard this story. The younger son made a request, and it introduces this man that had these two boys. Like many families that have two, they're totally different from one another. There's the one that we see is frivolous. The younger one is ready to squander everything, while the older one is diligent and conservative. They have these common titles of these stories, and we think of the prodigal son when we think of this story. It sort of implies that the younger one is the prodigal, and the older one is the good boy. Do you have good kids or favorite kids? The ones that don't give you the headaches and keep you up at night? Well, the older brother is actually the focus of this story. I know much more attention is given to the younger. But the younger one's action at the beginning sets in motion a set of events that leads to the older brother's reaction. When I think of prodigal, it's a term that is describing someone who is a spendthrift. It's someone who extravagantly spends on self-indulgent items. Someone who is recklessly wasteful with resources. It accurately describes the younger of the two. It's shocking. It's bold. It might even be considered demanding of the younger son to make a request that is unheard of. Before you die, Dad, I want you to divide it all up. Several years ago, Simra, my older daughter, worked for our friend Andy, who's an attorney. I've told this story because it is just off the wall. And they were home one time for, I believe it was some kind of holiday period. And we have a grand piano in the dining room. We're not dining room people, but anyway. And Simra is sitting, not really playing the piano, but touching it. And I hear her tell her brother that someday this is going to be mine. And Stephen looked back at her and said, well, then fine. I get all of the things that are in the garage, all of the tools. And she says, well, that's fine, but I want that particular painting. And it wasn't long before I had to interrupt them because they were dividing up my stuff. I remember when she looked over at me and she says, Dad, do you have a will? And I said, yes, we do. She said, where is it? I told her where it was at, where a copy of it was. She says, what does it say? I wanted to say, well, you have to wait and see, but I realized that the stress level was really high at this particular moment in her life anyway. Wasn't any stress in mine. And I said, well, you and your brother will share everything equally, and I'll try to have it all paid off for you so that you'll get it. In this particular case, there was an estate We don't know how lavish it was. We get the impression that it was involved. When you think of estate, you immediately think of properties, material possessions that one might inherit. It's interesting to note that this is the only place in all of the New Testament that this term is used, estate. This particular boy was unwilling to take the responsibility that came with his share of the estate. He selfishly wanted to liquidate it and use whatever he could get for his own pleasure. Now here's the dad. Instead of being furious, what does the father do? He divides up everything that he has between his two sons. People would have expected at this particular moment in the story for the father to be furious and to shame his son and disown him and dishonor him in public. Do whatever disciplinary action would be needed. Instead of slapping his son across the face, the father gives him what he wanted. There's a point here to be careful. We sing the song, "Oh, be careful, little." Be careful what you ask your father for. He might give it to you. Well, the rebellion of this younger son is seen in verse number 13 through 16 as the spiral continues downward. It seems that he wastes no time in gathering together everything that he received and in turn somehow turn it into cash, activating whatever tangible assets that he might have in this estate and liquidating them. I get the impression that there's speed involved in this. So therefore, whenever you try to liquidate something in haste, you always take a small percentage of what it's really worth. I don't believe anyone could take possession of the land because of what I know about Jewish culture. But at the father's death, they could. And at this point, he would sell like futures. That out here in the future, eventually my dad is going to die. I want to go ahead and sell my part of the estate now. You give me the money. Obviously, you get it at a discount, knowing that later on it'll be worth much more. If things weren't bad enough, he dishonored his father, ignoring his responsibility to his family, and sets off. And it says that he goes in a wasteful, sinful lifestyle. To the Jews, that meant anywhere outside of the nation of Israel. Far beyond any range of accountability. No one gets to tell him when to wake up in the morning, how long he's supposed to work that day, or if he's supposed to work at all. No one is watching. That father's eye is totally foreign to him at this point, and his actions, no matter how disgraceful they might have been, are out of sight. You've got to wonder, at that particular moment, when the boy's asking for his side of the possessions, why the older brother didn't stand up, didn't mediate, didn't try to come to some kind of honorable conclusion to this. If he truly loved his father, he would have defended his honor from this irresponsible action of this younger brother. If he really loved his brother, he would have intervened to prevent him from ruining his life. As he hears about this, he's totally absent in the story. The picture of a gracious father who gives his all to two ungrateful, unloving sons, both of whom had absolutely no relationship with him or with each other. And guess what? The story goes on. The younger son takes everything that he can gather together and he squanders it. He loses it. He scatters it. And with everyone who doesn't replenish what they spend, eventually they go broke. That is the closest I'll ever get to advice to you on finances. If you spend more than you bring in, eventually you'll be broke. To be rich in America means that you spend less than what you bring in. In this particular case, it seemed that he brought nothing in. He totally spent it all without trying to replenish it at all. And finally, at some point in his life, the very first time in his life, it says that he began to be, did you see this word? In want. He had forsaken his family. He had forsaken all of his, I guess, so-called friends, and they forsook him. He was a stranger in a foreign land, nowhere to go, no one to turn to for help. He was penniless, destitute, and without any resources. Seeking this unrestrained pleasure, he ended up losing everything that he had, and we find him in pain and emptiness. But he's not ready to go back. He might be penniless, he might be in pain, but he's certainly not ready. In other words, he's not found the bottom of his barrel. And then that moment, he hires himself out to a pig farmer. The King James talks about attaching himself. It talks about going to a stranger there in the land, a Gentile country, and he goes and hires himself out or latches on. It gives me the connotation of someone who constantly torments or bugs somebody until they finally give in, and they give him one of the lowest jobs that they could think of, feeding the pigs. Reduced to fighting the pigs off for the pods that they were going to eat, he has a vision. He starts looking at himself, and he starts looking at his situation, and he finds nothing. He sees that he, at this particular point, has been a sinner in the midst of rebellion against his father, who disdains that which is evil, but loves him beyond understanding. And we see a picture of each one of us, don't we? For every single one of us are that one who claims everything that we can get and waste it on whatever self-pleasures that we might have. And then when it all turns upside down, we start thinking about God. In this particular case, he starts to repent. In the depths of his hopelessness and despair, focusing on the starvation that he was experiencing, he comes to his senses, and he makes a statement. My father has hired servants that are better off than I am. He remembered the graciousness of his father, the compassion that his father had. He recognized the reality of who he was and who he had ended up being. And he made a decision. He says, I'm going to go back to my father. And I am going to repent of what I have done. I'm going to admit to him that what I did was crazy and stupid and sinful in the sight of God, and mostly in his sight as well. And I'm going to tell him that I'm no longer worthy to be a son and to make me one of those hired servants. In the culture of the day, that would allow him the ability to pay back if it were possible. He rehearsed his speech. He said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and upon your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me one of your hired servants. That's what needed to be said. That was the requirement of the confession. Just as every single person that lives on the face of this earth needs to come before God and admit that they are a sinner. That within them there is no righteousness at all. And that all of the righteousness is found in God. And repenting and trusting in our Father and his compassion and his mercy to do with us as he sees fit. Well, you know the story. He gets there to his father. And I think that the reception is beyond any kind of imagination. The results of this is more than what anyone who's listening to this story could possibly ever understand. Even while he was a long way off, it says, before entering into the village, his father saw him, indicating to me that the father was been watching for him, been looking for him, been waiting for him, been suffering silently, hoping day after day that his shameful son would return. The scribes and the Pharisees that heard this would have been expected that the son, if he did return, that the father would remain honorable. In other words, the father would refuse to see him. Instead, he would set him on the outside of the city gate, away from the family home, and maybe allow him to live there for days in shame. And finally, he would grant an audience with his son, in which would be a very cool reception at best. And the son then would have to come before his father and humble himself. And he would be expected to tell his son what works were necessary for him to pay back all restitution. Instead, Jesus says that the father, upon seeing him a long way off, felt the compassion for him and ran out. The father ran out, embraced him and kissed him. The father takes upon himself his son's shame and immediately reconciles him in full honor of sonship. Middle Eastern noblemen didn't run. The concept of the father running out to his son was demeaning. Embracing him in all of his impoverished filthiness and vile rags and dirt upon his face, he kisses him. And finally the son gets to rehearse his little speech. And it's interesting that the father interrupts him, graciously ignoring the fact that he was willing even to work to pay back. The father gives a visible evidence of his reconciliation. Instead of just saying you're forgiven, you see in the story that the father tells the servant immediately, go get a robe and put on him. Symbolizing that time in which the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we which are alive and remain to be with the Lord in the air will have new garments that Jesus gives to each one of us. It says that the father put a ring on his finger, the signet ring of the family, with a family crest upon it that would seal the documents that the father had. He gave to his son, showing everyone, I fully embrace this one, my son, as being equal with me in making any kind of decisions that might be made. Put sandals on his feet. A slave never wore sandals. A hireling never had shoes to wear. The upper crust of people would have sandals to put on. It's interesting when you think back of the stories of Jesus that John the Baptist says, I'm not worthy to tie Jesus' sandals. The father gives him the robe, gives him the ring, gives him the sandals, and then orders the fatted calf to be slaughtered. We are going to rejoice in my son's return. We are going to have a major party. I couldn't help but think of Jesus coming out on the portals of glory and calling his children home, and then start rewarding them as the Bema seat of Christ takes place. And those who know Christ will all come in the marriage supper of the Lamb, and there the celebration will take place. And each one of us will stand before the Lord, and he will give us the crown of righteousness in which God himself grants to us. And give us the crown of faithfulness, and give us the crown of rejoicing in the fact that we are now home, never to be wandered or separated from our God ever again. I thought it was interesting that when it came to the lost sheep, that there was a few friends, the villagers came together. When it came to the lost coin, that the woman found a few neighbors to come together and rejoice with her. But here in this story, it was the whole country comes together. The whole group of anyone that was within earshot would know. Just like on that day when the trumpet sounds all over this world. At one moment in time, the Bible says, in the twinkling of an eye, we'll be caught up together to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we ever be with the Lord. In verse number 25 through verse number 32, all the attention now was on the son, remember? The younger son that went out and spent it all, came to himself, comes back. And then in the middle part, you see the dad. Oh, he sees his son from afar off and runs out there in compassion and embraces him as a son. And here at the end, we look at the older son. Verses number 25 through 32 is all about this younger son. He was out in the field, it says, overseeing the workers, unaware of his brother's return. And when he came in from the field and approached his house, it said he heard the music and the dancing. Must be loud dancing. That's how I know that these weren't Baptists, because they wouldn't be dancing at all. Surprised to find all of the village in celebration. He comes in and he gets one of the servants aside and he says, "What in the world is going on?" And he's stunned as he hears the servant say, "The party is for your brother." Now, I suppose someone could criticize the dad for spending that which wasn't his. Well, in legal terms, it belonged to the son. He divided his estate. He still had rights to it. He still owned a robe and a ring and sandals. I think that the servant's response here, that your brother has come home, should have filled the older brother with joy. That his brother had returned, that he's safe, if for no other reason that his father was celebrating. Instead, he was outraged. He was infuriated. Anger built up within him until he couldn't think straight. Even worse than that, from his perspective, he realized that his father had already given the boy his word of reconciliation. You see, this older son was just as wicked as the younger son. He was wicked on the inside, while his younger brother was wicked on the outside. And in this event, it really exposed what was on the inside of him. In a burst of public display of long cultivated private hatred, it says he became angry and he wasn't willing to go in to the party or the celebration. He couldn't rejoice. He couldn't rejoice over his brother coming home because he didn't love his brother. And he certainly didn't love his father. He failed to understand this unmerited favor. He couldn't get it around his mind, this idea of free forgiveness and deliverance from shame. You see, the Pharisees, listening to Jesus' story, would have considered the father's actions outrageous and shameful, in the same way that they thought of Jesus when he associated himself with tax collectors and sinners, that he too must be wicked. The older son was a hypocritical legalist doing what was expected of him on the outside. But inwardly he was filled with that secret sin of bitterness or hatred or jealousy or anger or lust. The truth is, he was more profoundly and truly lost than his younger brother was, because he spent his life convincing himself, and he convinced all those around him, that he was good and his brother was evil. The older son's pinned up anger and bitterness and resentment spills out, and this time directly to the father. There was no love. There's no respect for his father. Merely toil and drudgery, waiting for him to die so he could inherit it all. It's a classic expression of self-righteous hypocrisy when he declared that he never one time ever neglected his duty as a father, as a son to his father. He implied that if he were to have a party, he certainly wouldn't have invited people of his own family or his own household. That would have been his friends that would have come to the party. It's a picture. Oh, isn't it a picture? A striking comparison between the legalist and the older brother and the graciousness of his father. While the father is seen as rejoicing in grace and love, his son, the older brother, is unrepentant, self-righteous, hypocritical like the Pharisees. And God sought to reconcile sinners to himself by sending his son Jesus Christ to pay the penalty of our transgressions. And at one point, he will join with us in a heavenly banquet and a celebration when we get together with him. Well, the older son spouts off, yelling at his father, telling him how stupid he was for welcoming this son of his back. The father graciously and gently responds to him as a loving father would. In dealing with his children, he gives him the truth. The father concluded in his statement saying that we had to celebrate. We had to. We had to rejoice. Takes me back to the beginning of this chapter. And it says what the whole chapter is about is God rejoicing over the fact that one sinner would come to repentance. And that we would celebrate. And that we would be overjoyed if an individual came to know Jesus as their Savior. The younger son symbolizing those who seek God's salvation by grace. The older one who seeks salvation by works. Now, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but there's a deliberate lack, we'll call it, of an ending. We're supposed to notice that. The story stops abruptly with this tender appeal that every hearer is to take to heart and meditate on it and personalize it and see the gentle rationale of embracing the Father's joy in a sinner's repentance. The parable is really an invitation to forsake our pride, to forsake our self-righteousness, and reconcile us with God. And the principle is seen. Every single person is a wanton sinner like the prodigal. Or maybe they're the sanctimonious, hypocritical elder brother. Or maybe we find ourselves somewhere between the two. But those who embrace the Father's loving compassion and grace beyond compare are accepted into his family. Well, here's the problem. How did the story end? I guess it depends on how you write the ending. Some of us write the ending that the older son was absolutely correct, takes his father to court, has the father removed from the estate, and his father ends up living homeless for the rest of his life. No, I don't want to think of that. As the ultimate legalist would sit here and say, well, the son was absolutely right. He shouldn't have taken that wicked brother back. Most of us want to think of the story as ending where the older son falls down at the feet of his father and repents and realizes how terrible it sounds, how horrible it would be to live in that legalistic world where there is no grace.